The first glimpse. It began as all mysteries often do, not with a roar, but with a whisper too subtle for the world to notice. In the silence of a remote observatory, hidden among the high volcanic slopes of Hawaii, a faint signature blinked into life across a digital screen. To the astronomer who happened to be on duty that night, it was just another wandering dot among thousands, a pale fragment of reflected light sliding across the dark canvas of the universe. The telescope, humming like a patient sentinel, had caught what at first seemed nothing more than a comet straying into view, yet the dot shimmered with an unusual sharpness, almost as if it carried its own secret fire. The observer leaned closer, frowning at the sudden spike of brightness. These readings did not match what was expected of mere ice and dust. The night grew colder in that small control room, the glow of the monitors throwing sharp angles against tired eyes, and the faint suspicion began to grow. Something was off. Within hours, other observatories across the globe began confirming the detection. Some claimed it was a comet, others whispered asteroid, but nothing fit neatly into the established catalogues. Its trajectory was not a looping dance around the sun. Instead, it seemed to cut across the solar system with a purposeful path, slicing through the familiar orbits like a needle through cloth. News spread among astronomers in hushed tones: an interstellar interloper, a visitor from far beyond, drifting into the reach of human instruments. Its speed, its angle, the cold mathematics of its trajectory, all pointed to one conclusion: it was not born of this solar system. Already, those who understood the implications felt a shiver pass through their bones. Earth was about to be written into a larger story. For the first few weeks, only specialists whispered its name. They called it 3I divided by Atlas, after the survey that had spotted it. But behind the sterile designation lay something far more stirring. The night skies above the deserts of Chile, the frozen silence of Antarctica, the dust-laden air of Arizona all now shared in the same vigil. As telescopes traced its path, a subtle awe grew. This was only the third confirmed interstellar object humanity had ever seen, and already it seemed determined to defy expectations. Observers described it as ghostly, almost alive in its shifting brightness, flaring and dimming like a heart that beat in slow, powerful rhythms. No ordinary visitor behaved this way. The public, at first, heard little. News outlets buried the story beneath political quarrels and earthly noise. But among the circles of astronomy, emails buzzed, files were exchanged, and encrypted calls were made between researchers who dared not voice their suspicions too loudly. There was an unease in their correspondence, an instinctive caution born of knowing how fragile public trust could be. But every night, as the telescopes gathered more data, that unease deepened into something heavier. Atlas was not merely passing through, it was performing. The first true alarm sounded when an automated brightness log showed an anomaly. In the middle of what should have been a steady decline, the object flared, shining 20 times brighter than expected, as though ignited by an invisible hand. The records were checked, the sensors recalibrated, but the numbers did not lie. In a span of hours, Atlas had blazed with a light that rivaled much larger celestial bodies, outshining predictions by a magnitude too large to be dismissed. To the untrained eye, it was just a distant glow, but to the astronomers, it was a rupture in reason itself. Late nights turned into frantic conferences. What could cause such a surge? Ice venting under solar heat? Dust scattering sunlight? Perhaps, but not to this degree. Nothing in the textbooks could explain a 20-fold leap in brilliance. Each possibility was noted, tested, and quietly discarded. Theories piled up like broken instruments, none able to play the right tune. And slowly, under the weight of unanswerable data, fear crept in. Not the kind of fear that sparks panic, but the kind that lingers, silent and heavy, like an old warning carved into stone. It was not long before a story began to form, a story only a few dared to put into words. They remembered the first interstellar visitor, Oumuamua, with its odd acceleration that no cometary model could explain. They remembered the whispers of artificial origin, the speculations hushed away by officials who feared ridicule. And now, here was another traveler, even stranger, arriving with its own defiance of natural law. Coincidence felt thinner with each passing night. In the small hours of the morning, the Hawaiian astronomer, who had first seen Atlas, returned to his screen, watching the light curve pulse faintly across the blackness. He thought of ancient sailors who once navigated by stars, of myths born from wandering lights that defied explanation, of omens written across the heavens. He wondered if, in some distant past, another pair of eyes had looked up and felt the same unease. He scribbled in his logbook a simple note that would never appear in official data releases. It is not behaving like it should. And so it began, the first glimpse of Atlas, a light stranger than any earthly fire, a mystery carried into the solar system from unknown shores, a dot on a screen, a whisper in the dark, the first step in a story that would unravel certainty itself, a stranger named Atlas. When the object finally earned its name, the weight of that title seemed almost too heavy for the letters that carried it. The International Astronomical Union gave it the designation 3I divided by Atlas, marking it as the third interstellar object ever recorded by humankind. The first, Oumuamua, had arrived in 2017 like a shard from another star, slipping past Earth with a silence that raised more questions than it answered. The second, 2I divided by Borisov, looked more like a traditional comet, though its path betrayed the same foreign origins. And now there was Atlas, the third, yet from the very beginning, it bore a character that felt uncomfortably different, as though it had come not only from another system but from another set of rules altogether. The world first learned its name not from sweeping headlines or glowing broadcasts, but from a brief notice tucked into scientific circulars. It was, at first, only a curiosity for those who watched the heavens closely, another cryptic entry in the endless list of moving points catalogued by astronomers. Yet those who dug deeper could not ignore its distinction. Interstellar, the word lingered like incense in the air, a reminder that this object was not bound by the familiar solar family, but had travelled untold light-years before arriving uninvited. Scientists whispered about the journey. Perhaps it had been ejected from a collapsing star system, flung into the abyss by the violent birth of new suns, wandering silently for millions of years until chance carried it here. That was the simple story, the one textbooks would approve. But behind closed doors, not everyone was satisfied with simplicity. As Atlas traced its way inward, telescopes recorded its shifting brightness with more urgency. Most comets brighten as they near the sun, releasing gas and dust that reflect more light, but Atlas seemed to flare in sudden, unpredictable pulses, as if responding to some hidden rhythm. It was this unpredictability that first sparked unease. What kind of object grows so luminous without the steady, mechanical process of sublimation? Its outbursts resembled signals, abrupt and forceful, like beacons flashing across the void. Scientists in press briefings offered calm explanations, careful not to sound alarmist. Outgassing behavior, they said, or fragmentation of surface ice. But the numbers in their private logs told a harsher truth. The energy involved in some of Atlas's bursts exceeded what could be explained by ice alone. Meanwhile, beyond the observatories, ordinary people began to catch wind of the story. Amateur stargazers uploaded images, faint streaks across the night sky, labeling them with excitement, the interstellar visitor. Their voices echoed across forums and social media, though most of the public remained unaware. To the larger world, still consumed by earthly noise, Atlas was little more than a whisper on the horizon. Yet in the shadows of institutions, where access to raw data was tightly held, there was no mistaking its strangeness. The more that was measured, the more the narrative began to fracture. Even among astronomers, divisions emerged. Some clung to the comfort of cometary models, insisting the oddities could be explained with patience and better data. Others, younger and less afraid of ridicule, dared to wonder aloud whether Atlas was following a logic unknown to natural bodies. They recalled the controversy of Oumuamua, when Harvard astronomer Avi Loeb suggested it might be artificial, an idea dismissed by many, but never fully disproven. Was Atlas, then, the second clue, in a pattern too large to ignore? As debates stirred, Atlas grew brighter, outshining stars it had no right to rival. Small observatories reported that their instruments strained to capture its glare without distortion. And then came the questions no one wanted to voice openly. Was it possible that Atlas was not a mere rock and ice fragment? Could it be engineered? The thought hung heavy, rarely written, but passed in cautious whispers between colleagues. If such a thing were true, the implications were staggering proof that humanity was not alone, and that something beyond Earth had chosen to enter its sky. The naming of Atlas, then, was more than formality. It became a symbol, a shorthand for the unknown. Each syllable carried the weight of its interstellar heritage, but also the dread of the secrets it might carry. For scientists, It was a puzzle. For governments, a potential threat. And for the few who stared into its unblinking light night after night, it was a presence that seemed to watch as much as it was watched. On a quiet night, the astronomer in Hawaii, the first to glimpse Atlas, sat alone reviewing data. Outside, the oceans sighed against the volcanic cliffs, but his gaze never left the glowing graphs. He whispered its name, Atlas, as though invoking something alive. He could not shake the sense that the name fit too well. In Greek myth, Atlas was the Titan who bore the weight of the heavens on his shoulders. Perhaps it was fitting, then, that this interstellar wanderer now bore the weight of human fear, wonder, and imagination. It was no longer just a streak of light in the sky. It had become a story, one that would stretch across nations, across disciplines, across the fragile boundary between science and myth. And beneath it all, a question burned silently, unanswered. What did Atlas truly carry with it across the stars? Brightness beyond reason. The strangeness of Atlas became undeniable when its light flared again, this time in a burst so powerful that even those who had dismissed earlier anomalies were forced to stop and reconsider. The brightness did not simply climb in a predictable curve as comets often do. It leapt, startlingly and violently, as though some hidden switch had been triggered. On the instruments it looked like a heartbeat, sharp spikes of luminosity, rising far above what models could predict, then settling back into a deceptive calm. Yet each new flare grew more insistent, as though the object was testing boundaries, experimenting with how much of itself it could reveal, before retreating into shadow once more. To astronomers accustomed to the measured, mechanical rhythms of celestial bodies, Atlas's behavior felt almost taunting. Natural objects obeyed laws, gravity, thermodynamics, the known chemistry of ices and dust. But this, 20 times brighter than the projections, entire equations crumbled in the face of such defiance. Theories that had served well for centuries bent until they snapped. Some scientists reluctantly adjusted their models, stretching them until they became absurd, proposing that Atlas must be shedding material at rates no comet could survive. Yet even then, the data refused to comply. The flares were too abrupt, too uneven, as if Atlas were ignoring the very sun that supposedly governed its behavior. The first leak came from within a European observatory. An email, quietly forwarded from one researcher to another, slipped into the hands of an eager journalist. It described unexplainable surges in brightness, inconsistent with sublimation activity. Though couched in careful language, the undertone of unease was unmistakable. The journalist published a small piece online, barely noticed by the wider world, but among astronomers it spread like wildfire. Some chastised the breach of protocol, others sighed in relief that someone had spoken aloud what many were already thinking. Still, the public remained largely in the dark, unaware that something unusual now burned in their skies. Meanwhile, in labs and offices, more troubling patterns were being uncovered. The brightness did not just spike randomly. It seemed to occur at intervals, faintly rhythmic, though never perfectly regular. Like a message struggling through static, it teased the possibility of intention. Teams began quietly running Fourier analyses, searching for signals hidden in the oscillations of light. Nothing concrete emerged, but the very fact that such analyses were being performed spoke volumes. This was no longer the patient observation of a comet. It was the beginning of an investigation, the suspicion that Atlas might be more than a passive traveler. And with suspicion came fear. If Atlas were merely unusual, there would be no need for secrecy. But as it flared in brightness far beyond reason, whispers of danger grew. A body shedding so much material could fragment unpredictably, perhaps even on a trajectory that intersected with Earth. Governments demanded classified briefings. Satellite time was requisitioned by military agencies, often without explanation. Astronomers accustomed to open collaboration found themselves locked out of their own data, told that certain images or logs were now restricted. Such restrictions only deepened the unease, for if there was nothing to hide, why hide at all? Among the few who still had unrestricted access, a strange mood began to form, half exhilaration, half dread. They stared at the graphs of Atlas's light curve late into the night, watching the impossible unfold, and though they could not say why, they felt as though they were being watched in return. The flares seemed almost reactive, brightening more when certain instruments aligned, dimming when observations ceased. Pure coincidence, of course, they told themselves. Yet coincidences piled upon coincidences until denial itself became a fragile comfort. The wider public finally took notice when amateur astronomers began to report the object with naked eye visibility in certain dark skies. Ordinary people, stepping out into the night, could see it as a faint but undeniable star that had not been there before. "What is that light?" became a question on countless lips, shared across social networks and whispered in neighborhoods. For some, it was wonder, a chance to feel connected to the immensity of the cosmos. For others, it was unease, the same ancient fear that once caused civilizations to tremble at comets streaking across the heavens. Brightness, when it comes unbidden, has always been a double-edged omen, and still, the object flared again, and again, each burst a defiance of natural order, each surge like a secret spoken too loudly. The world did not yet know what to make of it, but for those who watched closely, one truth was becoming impossible to escape. Atlas was not behaving as an object of chance. It was performing a role, and humanity was its audience. The leak that shook observatories. The first true rupture in the wall of silence came quietly, carried not by a major broadcast or official statement, but by the trembling hands of an anonymous whistleblower. For weeks, scientists had been privately wrestling with the data that defied explanation. Atlas shining 20 times brighter, its erratic flares, its disobedience to every known law of cometary behavior. But now, tucked into an encrypted message slipped across the digital void, came a leak. It was a document stamped "Restricted Observatory Confidential," written in the dry, clipped prose of technical reporting, but its contents burned hotter than any headline. The document summarized findings from multiple observatories across Europe and North America, each confirming the same anomaly. Atlas's brightness could not be explained by surface ice sublimating under solar heat. It referred to non-thermal emissions, a term so out of place in cometary study that it read like a riddle. Non-thermal, as though the light pouring from Atlas was not merely sunlight reflected, nor heat-driven release of gas, but something else entirely, something intrinsic. One line in particular captured attention. Observed flaring activity is inconsistent with cometary models. Data suggests deliberate modulation cannot be ruled out. Deliberate modulation, two words that, once read, could not be unseen. If brightness was not random, but modulated, controlled, then the entire paradigm shifted. It implied not a rock tumbling from the stars, but perhaps a messenger. And if that possibility were true, then humanity had stumbled into a moment that no government, no agency, no observatory was prepared to face. The leak spread in hushed waves. At first, only insiders recognized its weight, astronomers forwarding the document to colleagues, astrophysicists whispering across encrypted forums. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, others as fabrication, but those who compared the numbers with their own data felt the blood drain from their faces. The match was too precise. Someone had risked everything to confirm what many were already afraid to admit. Atlas was breaking the script. It did not take long for journalists to catch scent of the story. A handful of independent science reporters published cautious pieces, quoting unnamed sources and speaking of unprecedented brightness anomalies. The mainstream media, wary of sounding alarmist, gave it little attention. But within the astronomy community, the leak was a spark thrown into dry tinder. Meetings grew tense. Emails became guarded, as though every word might later be scrutinized. Directors of observatories issued stern reminders about confidentiality agreements, yet the harder they tried to smother the whispers, the more they spread. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to suspicion. Why were certain images suddenly classified? Why had military satellites been repositioned to observe Atlas? Why were researchers receiving unexpected calls from government liaisons urging them to remain cautious in interpretation? The weight of secrecy pressed heavier with each passing day. The leak had cracked the dam, and though officials rushed to patch it, the water was already seeping through. Meanwhile, Atlas continued its silent performance in the heavens. Each new burst of light felt, to those watching, like a response not random, not blind, but measured, as though the object itself were aware of the growing attention. Some scientists began keeping personal journals, recording thoughts they dared not share in professional settings. In one, later leaked itself, an astronomer wrote, "When it brightens, I feel as if it is looking back. We have no language for this. Perhaps the light is the language." The public, too, began to sense that something was being hidden. Amateur skywatchers noticed that professional observatories had grown strangely quiet on forums where once they eagerly shared discoveries. Questions piled up. Why so little coverage? Why did official outlets downplay the story? And what of the sudden claims circulating online that Atlas's flares matched suspicious intervals, like a beacon repeating itself? Governments did not respond directly, but their silence only deepened the intrigue. The more the truth was contained, the more it leaked through the cracks. And in those cracks, fear bloomed. Not the theatrical panic of disaster movies, but a quieter, deeper dread. The sense that something had entered our solar system, and those in power did not know how to explain it, or perhaps did not want to. It was in this climate of secrecy and suspicion that the legend of Atlas began to take root. No longer just a comet or interstellar rock, it had become something more, a mystery thickened by denial, an omen amplified by the silence of those who should have spoken. The leak had shattered the illusion of control. The story could no longer be buried, and from that moment onward, Atlas belonged not only to science, but to history. Origins in question. From the moment Atlas was confirmed to be interstellar, the question of its origin became the thread pulling at the fabric of everything scientists thought they understood. For comets within our own solar system, the story is usually clear enough. Fragments of ice and rock left over from the sun's formation, drifting in long elliptical orbits until gravity nudges them inward. But Atlas, like Oumuamua and Borisov before it, had crossed an unfathomable gulf to arrive here. Its trajectory bore no return loop, no promise of circling back. It had come from elsewhere, and once it left, it would never return. That alone made it a stranger, but its behavior, its impossible brightness, made it something closer to an enigma. In university lecture halls, professors stood before blackboards filled with hastily drawn diagrams. They spoke of distant star systems ejecting comets during their formation, of violent gravitational slingshots hurling debris into interstellar space. Students scribbled notes, but even the professors' voices carried hesitation. Could such violence truly account for the object's peculiar brightness, its strange surges, its erratic glimmers? Some nodded, others frowned. Beneath the scientific language, one truth lingered unspoken. Atlas did not behave like an orphaned rock. Speculation soon stretched further. A camp of researchers suggested it might be a fragment from a shattered planet, an icy moon torn apart when its parent world collapsed into a dying star. Perhaps Atlas was a survivor, a relic carrying the scars of a system long since destroyed. If so, then each flare of light might not be defiance but grief, a cosmic echo of the world it once belonged to. The idea was poetic, even comforting, but it did not quiet the more troubling questions. Others, emboldened by the leaked documents hinting at deliberate modulation, ventured into territory most avoided, the possibility that Atlas was not a natural fragment at all. They pointed to the peculiar shape suggested by light curves, neither spherical nor jagged in the usual sense, but elongated, almost engineered. They noted the rhythmic character of the brightness changes, as though they carried intent. In hushed tones, behind closed doors, they asked whether Atlas might be something crafted, an ancient probe, perhaps, sent from a civilization long vanished. These discussions rarely reached the public, but within scientific circles, tension grew sharp. Conferences that should have been collegial descended into cautious debates, with every word weighed against the risk of ridicule. For some, the very suggestion of artificiality was intellectual heresy, a stain that could ruin reputations. For others, silence felt like complicity. "We owe the truth to history," one anonymous astronomer wrote in a journal entry later uncovered. "Even if we do not understand it, we must admit what it is not. And it is not merely a comet." Meanwhile, evidence from radio telescopes complicated matters further. A few observatories claimed to detect faint anomalies, bursts of static, unlike typical background noise when directed at Atlas. Officially, they were dismissed as interference, signals from earthbound technology bleeding into the data. Yet the timing was suspicious. More than once, the bursts seemed to align with the moments of greatest brightness. Was it coincidence, or a clue that Atlas was whispering across the void in ways humanity lacked the patience to decipher? Public curiosity swelled as amateur astronomers continued posting photographs of the object. To most, it was still framed as a comet, its name tied to familiar myths of wandering ice and dust. But threads began appearing in obscure corners of the internet, where enthusiasts debated whether it was something far stranger. They dug into historical accounts of comets brightening the skies before great calamities, drawing parallels between ancient omens and modern data. They asked if Atlas might be the same kind of visitor those civilizations had seen, catalogued in myth rather than mathematics. And yet, for every question asked, silence pressed heavier. Governments offered no clarity, scientists spoke in guarded terms, and the leaks only deepened the sense that truth was being obscured. The origins of Atlas remained suspended in uncertainty, balanced between the comfort of natural explanations and the dread of unnatural ones. In one midnight session, a small group of astronomers huddled around a glowing monitor, their faces lit pale by the jagged graph of Atlas's latest flare. One of them, voice low and strained, asked the question none dared write in a report. What if it's not from where, but from who? The silence that followed was longer than the data session itself, because every soul in that room understood the magnitude of what had just been said. The origins of Atlas were no longer merely a question of astronomy, they had become a question of existence. The silent acceleration. It was the trajectory that betrayed the first undeniable fracture in natural law. From the earliest measurements, Atlas had been mapped with exquisite precision. Its interstellar path had been charted by the mathematics of gravity, projected with models that allowed astronomers to predict where it would be weeks, even months ahead. But then the numbers stopped matching the sky. At first, the discrepancies were so slight they could be dismissed fractions of an arc-second, the kind of shift that could be blamed on faulty instruments or atmospheric distortion. Observers adjusted their equipment, recalibrated their sensors, double-checked against star positions. Yet the drift persisted. Each night, the object was not quite where it should have been. And then the truth became impossible to ignore. Atlas was accelerating, not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to the naked eye, but with a silent, steady push that could not be explained by gravity alone. The sun's pull was accounted for, the tugs of planets modeled with precision, and yet Atlas crept off course. The deviation was subtle, elegant, as if guided by a hand unseen. Comets are known to accelerate slightly when solar heat causes jets of gas to burst from their surface. But those jets leave signatures visible, outgassing, trails of dust, streaks that telescopes can trace. Atlas displayed none of these. It gleamed brighter, yes, but its surface betrayed no plumes, no chaotic eruptions to account for its motion. The acceleration was clean, noiseless, unaccompanied by the violence of venting ice. Among astronomers, the whispers turned into shouts muffled only by locked doors. They remembered Oumuamua, the first interstellar visitor, which had also deviated from its expected course. That anomaly had been explained away barely by theories of hidden outgassing, though no such evidence was ever observed. And now, years later, Atlas repeated the pattern, only more decisively, as if mocking humanity's attempt to rationalize the impossible. Two interstellar objects in a row displaying unexplained accelerations. Coincidence strained credulity. Private reports circulated between observatories, stamped with caveats and disclaimers. Non-gravitational acceleration detected. The words were technical, but their weight was unbearable. Non-gravitational meaning something other than the forces that shaped every natural object humanity had ever studied. Something unaccounted for, something unknown. It was in one of these reports, leaked later, that an unnamed scientist scrawled a margin note that spoke more truth than the official data. It moves as though it has somewhere to go. Governments, already wary after the brightness anomalies, reacted swiftly. Access to orbital calculations was restricted. Certain datasets vanished from public repositories. Agencies announced that the object's path was under review, a phrase that revealed nothing and concealed everything. Even within scientific institutions, information became compartmentalized. Researchers who once collaborated openly now found themselves siloed, each permitted only fragments of the whole. Yet rumors spread nonetheless. Amateur astronomers, though lacking the resources of major observatories, were skilled at calculating orbits. They, too, noticed the drift. Online forums buzzed with suspicion. Was Atlas accelerating intentionally? Was it, like a spacecraft, adjusting its course? The idea was dismissed by mainstream outlets as fringe speculation, but the whispers could not be silenced. For those closest to the data, the silence of acceleration was the most unnerving aspect. Unlike the violent roar of rocket engines or the chaotic jets of sublimating ice, this movement was almost elegant, quiet as a breath. It suggested precision, control, perhaps even purpose. It was not the behavior of a dying fragment of rock, it was the behavior of something alive, or something made. In late-night sessions, astronomers stared at graphs that told them more than they wished to know. Each curve, each deviation, pointed toward intent. And intent was a word no scientist wanted to place into an official report. To admit intent was to admit agency. To admit agency was to admit that humanity was no longer alone in its observations of the sky. One astronomer, sleepless and hollow-eyed, wrote in her personal journal, "The stars no longer feel still. When I watch Atlas move, I feel as if we are the ones being observed." The object continued its silent acceleration, indifferent to the confusion it left behind. And on Earth, in the shadows of observatories and the corridors of power, the implications grew too heavy to contain. What had once been a comet was now something else entirely, a traveler whose journey could no longer be explained by chance. Eyes in the sky. The shift happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet for those who watched the flow of satellite taskings and classified orbital schedules, the signs were unmistakable. Atlas had attracted more than the gaze of astronomers. It had drawn the eyes of governments, and with them, the eyes of machines built not for wonder, but for surveillance. High above Earth, in the cold silence of orbit, satellites that usually tracked adversaries, weather systems, or missile launches were suddenly reassigned. Their lenses pivoted, not toward the ground, but outward, into the dark expanse where Atlas drifted like a luminous scar across the sky. Entire nights of imaging were redirected. Operators whispered about orders marked priority observation. What had once been the exclusive domain of science was now guarded by classified optics. The first clue leaked through a mistake. Amateur radio enthusiasts monitoring satellite downlinks noticed an unusual burst of encrypted transmissions aligned with the times Atlas flared. Normally, such traffic flowed steadily, but these came in urgent spikes, as though images were being rushed back to ground stations. No public explanation was offered. When questioned, agencies issued the same refrain: routine astronomical monitoring. But routine had never required this much secrecy. Those within observatories felt the change keenly. Data requests submitted to satellite operators were suddenly denied, replaced by form letters citing national security. Astronomers who had collaborated for decades across borders now found themselves on opposite sides of walls they could not breach. What was being seen, they asked, that could not be shared? What had the satellites captured in their high-resolution imagery of Atlas that telescopes on Earth could not reveal? Theories multiplied. Some believed the satellites had imaged surface features, regular structures, perhaps patterns too precise to be natural. Others whispered about strange emissions detected in non-visible spectra, heat signatures or radiation bursts that ordinary instruments could not detect. Each theory was more unsettling than the last, but none could be confirmed, because the truth had vanished into classified vaults. Still, fragments slipped through. A grainy image, said to be leaked from a defense contractor, circulated in obscure forums. Atlas rendered not as a fuzzy point, but as an elongated shape, shimmering unnaturally, with sharp edges inconsistent with tumbling ice. Most dismissed it as fabrication, a hoax crafted by conspiracy hunters. But for those who had already seen the restricted data, the image struck too close to reality to be ignored. In the public sphere, the silence only fueled curiosity. Amateur astronomers became restless, rallying their communities to capture every possible image of Atlas before secrecy tightened further. They posted long exposure photographs, stacking data across nights, desperately trying to resolve the object into more than a streak of light. Some reported anomalies glimmers, faint spikes radiating outward like the geometry of antennas. Each post drew skeptics, but also believers, and the debate grew louder. Inside government halls, however, the tone was not one of debate but of urgency. The classified imagery had raised questions officials did not know how to answer. Was Atlas truly a fragment of a distant system, or was it something crafted by intelligence unknown? And if crafted, was it functioning still? Satellites were ordered to continue their vigil, watching for patterns in its acceleration, monitoring for emissions in every conceivable wavelength. The sky had become not only a source of wonder, but of potential threat. For the scientists still permitted a glimpse of the truth, the secrecy weighed heavily. One astronomer, after a restricted briefing, returned to his office pale and shaken. He could not speak of what he had seen, bound by layers of classification, but he confided in his private notes, "If this is what they showed us, what are they hiding still? Atlas does not look like it belongs to chance." The watchers on Earth grew more numerous, their instruments sharper, their motives heavier. Yet above them all, Atlas moved without haste, pulsing with impossible light, accelerating with silent grace. It gave no sign that it cared for the eyes turned toward it. If anything, its performance seemed to grow bolder, as though it knew it had already become the center of humanity's gaze. And in the stillness of orbit, as satellites whispered images back to secret rooms, a new realization began to take root. Atlas was not only being observed, it was being surveilled, interrogated, studied like a suspect. The roles had shifted. No longer was it a visitor welcomed by curiosity. Now it was a presence watched with suspicion, as if it were the one holding secrets about Earth, rather than the other way around. The forbidden report. The whispers of secrecy that had surrounded Atlas grew into a storm the day the report surfaced, a document that was never meant for public eyes, written not in the cautious tones of academic speculation, but in the clipped, urgent cadence of military analysis. It was known simply as the Atlas Contingency Brief, stamped with classifications that should have buried it in vaults beneath government facilities, and yet, as so often happens when too many hands are told to hold silence, it leaked. The report was unlike the astronomical papers that had trickled from observatories in the months before, where scientists spoke of brightness anomalies and non-gravitational acceleration. This paper spoke of possible craft signatures, vector modulation, and most chilling of all threat scenarios. It treated Atlas not as a comet or a fragment, but as an object of potential strategic interest. Its language was stripped of wonder, stripped of poetry, reduced to cold assessments. Could it maneuver? Could it communicate? Could it alter orbit in ways that would intersect with Earth? One section, written with blunt precision, stood out. Observed accelerations consistent with course corrections. Probability of natural explanation diminishing. Another, buried deeper, was even more unsettling. If artificial, likelihood of reconnaissance platform cannot be dismissed. The words carried the weight of centuries of paranoia, a reflexive instinct of militaries to view the unknown not as mystery but as surveillance. To those who read it, the implication was clear somewhere in the halls of power. People were preparing for the possibility that Atlas was not only alive with intent, but was watching us. The leak spread faster than any attempt to contain it. Shared first in obscure digital channels, it was soon dissected by bloggers, journalists, and conspiracy theorists alike. Many dismissed it as fabrication, the work of hoaxers feeding on public unease, but others compared its phrasing, its formatting, to authentic military briefs, and found the style chillingly accurate. Experts in intelligence writing admitted, reluctantly, that it felt real, and that feeling was enough to fuel the fire. Among scientists, reactions were mixed. Some raged at the document, calling it reckless, a dangerous distortion of data that belonged to science, not speculation. Others, though, found themselves unable to dismiss it. They had seen the same anomalies, the same unexplainable brightness, the same silent accelerations. They too had whispered questions they dared not write in academic journals. And now, here it was, those forbidden questions, laid bare in the cold ink of military pragmatism. What unsettled them most was not what the report claimed, but what it omitted. Entire sections were redacted, replaced with thick black bars. What had been deemed too dangerous to share, even within classified circles. The gaps loomed larger than the words that remained, as if the heart of the truth had been cut out and buried deeper still. For the public, the forbidden report became a rallying point. Online communities exploded with theories. Some insisted Atlas was a derelict probe from a vanished civilization, wandering the stars until chance delivered it here. Others claimed it was active, perhaps even responding to our observations with its bursts of light. A darker faction muttered of weapons, of long-dormant machines waiting to awaken. The debate grew fevered, and with each passing day Atlas burned brighter in the sky, as though mocking the arguments below. Governments denied the report's authenticity, of course. Officials called it misinformation, a fabrication, the work of those who thrived on stirring fear. Yet their denials rang hollow. If it were false, why restrict astronomers more tightly? Why reroute satellites? Why did officials refuse to answer questions about the object's unexplained trajectory? The silence spoke louder than their dismissals. For those closest to the story, the report left scars. Astronomers who had once fought for clarity now felt themselves pulled into a darker narrative. One, after reading the leaked brief, admitted in a private letter, "I no longer look through the telescope with the same eyes. I do not see a comet. I see a presence, and I wonder if it sees me in return." The forbidden report changed everything. It took the whispers of mystery and hardened them into suspicion. It gave weight to the idea that Atlas was not just an object drifting through space, but a visitor with intention, and perhaps with eyes. And once that idea took root, it could not be undone. The tale of previous visitors. When the forbidden report spread through hidden channels and seeped into public discourse, it did more than ignite debate over Atlas itself. It stirred the dust of memory. Across cultures and centuries, humanity has always looked upward with fear and awe when strange lights crossed the heavens. Now, with Atlas blazing 20 times brighter than it should, historians and storytellers were summoned into the conversation. The present mystery breathed new life into ancient tales, tales of visitors that had once been forgotten or dismissed as superstition. It began with scholars of antiquity, who saw echoes of Atlas in records far older than telescopes. Ancient Chinese astronomers, meticulous in their skywatching, once wrote of stars that grew in brilliance as if possessed by spirit, only to fade without warning. In Babylonian tablets, comets were described as messengers of the gods, their unexpected brightness seen as warnings. In Mayan codices, drawings of blazing orbs descending from the heavens carried grim associations with famine and upheaval. None of these accounts were precise science, yet each whispered the same unease now felt in modern observatories, brightness that behaved like no natural light should. As the comparisons spread, another thread emerged. Many civilizations had myths of wanderers who came not just once but repeatedly, their appearances tied to cycles of fear and reverence. The Polynesians spoke of Timata Ararangi, the eyes from the heavens, lights that grew strong enough to guide sailors across vast seas but were always spoken of with caution. Medieval European texts recorded guest stars that flared violently before plagues and wars, vanishing afterward as suddenly as they had appeared. Could Atlas, some asked, be another in that lineage? Not the first, but one of many, part of a continuum that stretched across human history, its earlier visits buried beneath layers of myth and allegory. Within the walls of archives and libraries, researchers began combing through dusty manuscripts with new urgency. They noted patterns in the timing of unusual celestial events, aligning them with historical catastrophes. Some correlations were chilling. A mysterious brightening comet in 1347, the very year the Black Death swept into Europe. Another in 1816, the year without a summer, when volcanic eruptions and famine ravaged nations. Coincidence, perhaps, but with Atlas burning unreasonably bright, coincidences no longer soothed. The whispers spread into the public realm as well. Documentaries rushed into production, pairing ancient myths with modern footage of Atlas glowing in the night sky. Conspiracy forums roared with claims that governments had long known of these visitors, that suppressed knowledge of previous interstellar objects had been hidden to keep humanity docile. Theories grew wilder, that ancient civilizations had not only witnessed Atlas or its kin, but perhaps even communicated with them, leaving behind cryptic monuments as proof. The pyramids, Stonehenge, the Nazca lines, all reinterpreted through the lens of this luminous stranger. And then came a revelation from a historian in Italy who uncovered a series of letters from the 17th century, written by an astronomer in Florence. The letters spoke of a fire in the sky that waxed and waned like the beating of a pulse. The astronomer had been convinced it was no comet, insisting it seemed governed by some hidden intelligence. His writings, dismissed in his own time, now felt hauntingly familiar. The language of the past mirrored the present too closely to ignore. Within observatories, the parallels unsettled the professionals. They had been trained to regard ancient tales as myth, yet here was modern data aligning with those very accounts. An astronomer in Chile confessed in a closed symposium, "We are not the first to see such a thing. We are only the first with the instruments to measure it, but I fear we are measuring what our ancestors already knew to fear." The tale of previous visitors began to take hold in the public imagination. Atlas was no longer just an isolated anomaly. It was a chapter in a longer, older story. Whether seen as myth or as misinterpreted astronomy, humanity had always recorded strange lights that came from elsewhere, flaring with impossible brilliance, leaving only questions in their wake. And now, As Atlas pulsed brighter than anything expected, the thought that it might belong to a lineage of sky wanderers began to feel less like speculation and more like inevitability. If there had been visitors before, what had they wanted? What had they left behind? And why had they always departed, leaving humanity with only fragments of fear and wonder? The astronomers who whispered these questions felt an old shiver in their bones, as though the past were reaching forward through centuries to warn them. This is not the first time the heavens have carried eyes. A pattern across centuries. The deeper scholars dug into the stories of past visitors, the more unnerving a pattern began to emerge. What had once seemed like isolated myths, tales of lights that blazed without cause, comets that flared like torches, now appeared to echo across centuries with unsettling regularity. Atlas, with its 20-fold brightness and silent defiance of physics, was no longer seen in isolation, but as the latest chapter in a recurring narrative too vast for coincidence. Historians combed through astronomical records, kept by the meticulous scribes of ancient China. Their guest star catalogues, carved into bamboo slips and silk scrolls, described events not unlike Atlas, wandering stars that brightened dramatically, vanished abruptly, and often appeared alongside political or natural upheaval. In one record dated 467 BCE, the court astronomer wrote, "It glowed with a radiance beyond calculation, and departed against the expected path." The phrase mirrored, almost eerily, what modern astronomers whispered about Atlas's brightness and acceleration. Further west, Babylonian tablets detailed omens tied to the heavens. One fragment, translated only recently, warned of a star that comes from no known path, bright as 20 torches, unseen before and gone too soon. Even the cautious archaeologists who studied these texts could not ignore the resonance with Atlas's sudden surges. In medieval Europe, monastic chronicles recorded sky fires that appeared at strange intervals, growing luminous enough to rattle entire towns. Some were dismissed as auroras, others as supernovae, but the language lingered oddly close to what Atlas now displayed, a light that waxed and waned without reason, as though commanded. These were not the words of poets alone, they were the careful notations of men sworn to accuracy, their duty to record signs they believed sent from heaven itself. As more evidence was drawn together, a chilling interval seemed to take shape. Roughly every 3 to 5 centuries, a sky visitor was described in ways inconsistent with natural comets. Each appeared briefly, each shone brighter than reason allowed, and each left behind trails of upheaval in human history, famine, plague, wars that followed in uncanny succession. Coincidence, the skeptics argued, was a stubborn force. Yet when the intervals were plotted on a timeline, the curve traced toward the present with disturbing precision. And there, glowing in the sky, stood Atlas. In secret, teams of historians and astronomers met to test the hypothesis. Could Atlas be part of a cycle? If so, was its arrival inevitable, not random? And if inevitable, what did that mean about its origin? The more they calculated, the heavier the conclusions became. If Atlas fit into the same rhythm as its predecessors, then its path through the solar system was not chance, but design its visits preordained, as though following a script written long before humanity could read the sky. Government analysts, poring over the same records, took a darker view. If such visitors had been appearing throughout history, always followed by disaster, then perhaps they were not merely messengers but catalysts. The Forbidden Report's shadow lengthened into this realm as well, suggesting that Atlas might not be a passive traveler, but an active participant in shaping human destiny. Whether through influence, observation, or something more sinister, its predecessors had left their fingerprints on history's most turbulent pages. Among the public, fragments of this pattern leaked into popular discourse. Documentaries spoke of the cycle of the wandering lights, pairing modern footage of Atlas with illuminated manuscripts of medieval comets. Online forums charted elaborate graphs, overlaying historical catastrophes with the supposed visits of luminous wanderers. Even skeptics, though dismissive of the more outlandish theories, found themselves unsettled by the alignment of dates and descriptions. One amateur historian, in a late-night webcast that spread rapidly, voiced the unease directly. If they've been coming for centuries, then this is not discovery. This is remembrance. Atlas isn't the first, and it will not be the last. Inside observatories, the mood grew heavy. Each flare of brightness was no longer a mystery in isolation, but a reminder of a pattern older than nations. older than modern science itself. Astronomers began to look backward as often as forward, reading the past with the same urgency as they tracked the present. For if Atlas fit the pattern, then perhaps the key to its purpose was buried not in future trajectories, but in histories humanity had long chosen to ignore. And in the silence of night, staring at the luminous stranger through the eyepiece of a telescope, one could not help but feel the echo of those who had watched before. The farmers who feared famine at the sight of strange stars, the monks who trembled at fiery omens, the emperors who asked their astronomers for guidance, all had once stood where humanity now stood, looking upward with a mixture of awe and dread. Atlas was not just a visitor. It was part of a pattern, a pulse across centuries, a thread woven into the very history of human fear. And as the object continued to brighten and drift silently off course, the question no one dared voice grew louder. Was this cycle by accident or by design? Shadows over Earth. By the time Atlas's light became familiar to the eyes of millions, the sense of wonder that had accompanied its arrival had begun to curdle into something darker. To casual stargazers, it was still a curiosity, a faint but brilliant wanderer against the night. But in the hidden corridors of government and science, the object was no longer seen as a marvel, it was seen as a shadow cast over Earth, a presence that loomed even when unseen. Officials gathered in rooms without windows, staring at projections of Atlas's trajectory as though its path were a knife waiting to fall. They spoke not in the language of astronomy, but in the language of contingencies. What if it broke apart? What if fragments entered Earth's atmosphere? What if its acceleration, still unexplained, was not random but directed? The questions bred simulations, and the simulations bred fear. On screens, digital models showed streaks of fire across continents, seas rising in tsunamis, skies darkened by dust. Though the probabilities were slim, the scenarios were catastrophic. It was enough to justify quiet preparations. Civil defense agencies were instructed to update emergency protocols, though the reasons were never explained to the public. Military forces tested rapid deployment drills under the guise of routine exercises. Stockpiles of supplies were quietly expanded. In some nations, encrypted directives instructed officials to prepare for unexpected celestial events. The words were deliberately vague, yet those who read them understood. The brightness in the sky was being treated as an unspoken threat. Meanwhile, scientists who continued to study Atlas felt a gnawing sense of helplessness. They watched its luminosity pulse, watched its path deviate ever so slightly, and knew they could not predict its next move. To chart the orbit of a comet was to tame the unknown with numbers. But Atlas defied the taming. Each new dataset seemed to shift just beyond explanation, as if mocking the calculations designed to cage it. For those who had dedicated their lives to understanding the heavens, it was like watching the sky slip out of human grasp. The public, still shielded from the most alarming data, sensed the tension anyway. Social networks swelled with speculation. Why were officials so quiet? Why did observatories stop releasing certain images? Why did satellites suddenly change orbits? Amateur astronomers noticed the same silence that professionals were forced into. The absence of answers was itself an answer. Something was being hidden. For ordinary people, the emotional tide shifted. At first, Atlas had been a curiosity, a light to show children through backyard telescopes, a reminder of humanity's smallness in the cosmos. But as whispers of secrecy spread, the light in the sky began to feel less like a gift and more like a warning. Old instincts awoke: comets as harbingers, lights as omens. Fear, once ancient, now wore the mask of modern anxiety. The brightness itself contributed to the unease. There were nights when Atlas flared so strongly that even city dwellers, beneath the veil of pollution, could glimpse it faintly overhead. It became a talking point in cafes, in offices, in hushed conversations at bus stops. Some described it as beautiful, even holy. Others said it made their skin crawl. The same object inspired reverence and dread, and in that duality it gained a power over the human mind that few celestial events ever had. In one small town in rural America, a pastor told his congregation that the light was a sign of approaching judgment. In Tokyo, artists painted murals of the sky-scorched earth beneath an unblinking star. In Brazil, a poet wrote that Atlas was a mirror held up by the universe, showing us our fear of being seen. Across the globe, the shadow lengthened not in the physical sense, but in the collective imagination of humankind. Behind it all, the astronomers continued their vigil. They no longer spoke freely in public, but in private they confided their unease. One wrote in his notes, "Every flare feels deliberate. Every deviation feels guided. I fear we are no longer watching an object, we are waiting for it to decide what it will do with us." The shadows over Earth were not cast by Atlas alone, but by the uncertainty it carried. It was the not knowing that darkened the sky more than any comet tail could. And as Atlas continued its bright, silent performance, Earth's people, scientists, leaders, and ordinary dreamers alike stood beneath it, each carrying the same quiet dread that the shadow above was only the beginning. The disputed signal. It began with static, innocuous, almost laughable in its ordinariness. A low hum recorded by a radio telescope in Australia, the kind of background noise that filled terabytes of raw data every night. Yet when technicians sifted through the records, a peculiar rhythm emerged. It was faint, buried beneath cosmic chatter, but it repeated. Every few hours, in alignment with Atlas's brightest flares, the signal returned. A narrowband burst, unnatural in its precision, cutting sharply through the white hiss of space. At first, it was dismissed. Interference was a constant nuisance in radio astronomy satellite transmissions. Radar pulses, even microwave ovens in nearby towns could masquerade as celestial phenomena. The technicians logged it as an anomaly, filed it away, and moved on. But then, the same pattern appeared in South America, and again, days later, in the cold records of a telescope in South Africa. 3 different continents, 3 different teams, all tracing the same faint heartbeat in the sky. The whispers began almost immediately. Was Atlas transmitting? Was the mysterious brightness not merely reflection but a coded message, written in photons and radio? Some scientists urged caution. Coincidence, they said. A trick of overlapping signals. But those who ran the data again, filtering with painstaking care, could not dismiss the alignment. The bursts came only when Atlas flared brightest. They did not match known satellites. They did not match any catalogued celestial phenomenon. They were, by definition, anomalous. The discovery did not stay confined for long. Within weeks, fragments of the data leaked online, accompanied by breathless claims of extraterrestrial communication. Enthusiasts overlaid the signal with visual graphs, noting its sharpness, its uncanny regularity. Theories bloomed like wildfire. Some argued it was a beacon, a deliberate call across the stars. Others claimed it was a probe, transmitting reconnaissance data back to its creators. A few, more cautious, wondered if it was nothing more than a cosmic coincidence, a quasar's distant murmur mistaken for intent. Governments responded with predictable speed. Observatories were instructed to tighten control over data releases. The leaked files were denounced as inconclusive or doctored. But the denials rang hollow when, days later, new bursts were detected, not by large institutions, but by amateurs with backyard radio dishes. Their equipment lacked the sensitivity of professional telescopes, yet even they recorded the faint, narrowband pulse, synchronized uncannily with Atlas's luminosity spikes. Whatever the source, it was real enough to reach the ears of ordinary citizens listening to the sky. The dispute grew ferocious. In scientific journals, cautious voices urged restraint, warning against the folly of chasing signals without definitive proof. Others argued the data should not be suppressed, that even the possibility of a message from Atlas demanded open study. Meanwhile, in the echo chambers of the internet, the matter was already decided. To believers, the signals were proof. Atlas was alive, aware, and speaking. But what was it saying? Analysts pored over the bursts, searching for patterns, encoding schemes, anything that might suggest a language. Some claimed to find primes hidden within the rhythm. Others argued the intervals resembled binary. A few insisted the entire structure was nothing more than noise dressed in human imagination. The debates spiraled endlessly, consuming nights and days. One astrophysicist, speaking anonymously, confessed her unease in an encrypted forum. It may not be language in the way we understand it. It may be something we cannot even classify as communication. But if it is synchronized with its brightness, then it is intentional, and intention means presence. The public fascination deepened into obsession. News outlets that once ignored the story now ran segments on the Atlas signal, framing it as either the greatest discovery in history or the greatest hoax. Governments doubled down on secrecy, fueling suspicion that they knew more than they admitted. The line between science and myth blurred further, and through it all, Atlas drifted silently across the sky, flaring as though indifferent to the storm it had unleashed below. To those who listened closely, the disputed signal carried an unnerving quality. It was not the content, but the consistency. Like a lighthouse beam cutting across an ocean, the bursts arrived with mechanical certainty, steady as a pulse, echoing against the vast silence of space. And for those who dared to believe, the thought was inescapable. Atlas was not just a wanderer, it was calling, and the world was beginning to hear. Whispers inside agencies. Inside the sealed rooms of government buildings, far from the telescopes and the chatter of public forums, the tone surrounding Atlas had shifted from curiosity to alarm. Officials no longer asked what it was, they asked what to do about it. The disputed signal, the impossible acceleration, the flares of unnatural brightness, all had moved the conversation beyond scientific debate. To the agencies tasked with guarding nations, Atlas was not a celestial mystery but a potential intelligence problem, and intelligence problems demanded responses, even when the data itself was still shrouded in uncertainty. Meetings became more frequent, sometimes twice daily, as liaisons from observatories were called to brief senior officials. In those meetings, men and women in suits sat with faces carved from stone, while scientists tried to explain the inexplicable. PowerPoint slides showed curves of brightness, timelines of signal bursts, projections of trajectory. The scientists spoke carefully, afraid of saying too much, yet equally afraid of saying too little. And still, in every meeting, the same question came from the officials. Is it natural? When the scientists hesitated, the silence was answer enough. What followed was argument, fierce and hushed. Intelligence officers warned of reconnaissance. If Atlas were artificial, then perhaps its signals were data streams, scanning Earth's atmosphere, its electromagnetic spectrum, even its defenses. Military planners raised the specter of orbital alterations, the possibility, however remote, that Atlas could maneuver in ways harmful to Earth. The more cautious voices urged patience. If it was only a comet, panic would be unforgivable. But the louder voices, the ones that spoke in terms of threat vectors and preparedness postures, began to dominate. The whispers spread beyond meeting rooms. Within agencies, analysts confided in colleagues, speaking low over coffee in guarded corridors. They spoke of intercepted chatter between foreign governments equally unsettled, of classified memos circulating with red ink phrases like potential craft and strategic observation. Some said satellite imagery had revealed patterns on Atlas's surface too sharp for geology. Others claimed that the signal bursts had been triangulated and showed coherence far greater than background noise could explain. No one could prove these whispers, but they spread nonetheless, carrying the weight of fear. One particular rumor chilled even the skeptics, that a subgroup within one agency had attempted active response. They had beamed directed signals toward Atlas, coded in simple binary, a greeting of sorts, hoping to provoke a change. Whether the attempt succeeded was unclear. Some whispered that shortly afterward, Atlas flared brighter than ever, 22 times its predicted luminosity. Coincidence, perhaps, but in the minds of those already fearful, it was enough to suggest that the object had answered. Meanwhile, ordinary scientists found themselves caught between curiosity and loyalty. Many had been invited into classified briefings, but bound with oaths of secrecy. They returned to their labs, pale and tight-lipped, unable to share what they had heard. In private journals, though, they sometimes left fragments. One such entry later leaked, read, "They argue about disclosure, but not about truth. The truth is already too large to control." Set she will da. In the public eye, little of this turmoil was visible. Officials issued calm statements, assuring citizens that Atlas posed no immediate threat. But behind those words was hesitation, a careful balancing act between preventing panic and hiding their own ignorance. And in the cracks of those statements, suspicion grew. The public sensed the dissonance, the way officials spoke too smoothly, too cautiously, like actors reciting lines. Inside the agencies, the debate raged on. Should humanity acknowledge Atlas openly, admit its strangeness, confess ignorance, or should the mystery be managed quietly, its truths locked away until certainty could be achieved? Neither choice came without peril. To speak too soon might unleash chaos. To remain silent might betray trust. And while the arguments swirled, Atlas continued its journey, indifferent to secrecy, flaring its silent message into the dark. One official, weary after hours of circular debate, voiced what many feared to admit. "We are not debating what Atlas is, we are debating how long we can pretend not to know." In that moment, the whispers inside agencies were not just about strategy or threat, they were about history, whether this era would be remembered as the one that hid the truth of the skies, or the one that finally dared to confront it. The simulations of doom. When the whispers within agencies turned into actionable fear, the natural next step was simulation. Governments thrive on models, on digital mirrors of disaster that allow them to prepare for storms, wars, pandemics. And so, inevitably, the supercomputers that once forecasted climate change and nuclear scenarios were tasked with something unprecedented, running worst-case projections of what Atlas might do if it were not a comet at all, but a maneuvering object capable of altering its path. The models began innocently enough. Engineers fed Atlas's current trajectory into orbital mechanics software, adding perturbations consistent with its unexplained accelerations. The results were unsettling. In scenario after scenario, tiny nudges accumulated over weeks, bending its path in ways no natural comet could achieve. Some runs showed Atlas skimming the orbits of Mars and Venus. Others showed it grazing Earth's orbit at perilously close distances. Though the probability remained low, the sheer possibility of directed approach made analysts pale. But then came the darker simulations, the ones classified at the highest levels. These did not treat Atlas as passive. Instead, they assumed intent. What if the flares of brightness were not merely emissions, but a form of propulsion? What if each pulse of light marked a maneuver, tiny course corrections building toward a chosen destination? When those assumptions were tested, the trajectories shifted like knives. Earth became not just a coincidence, but a potential rendezvous. On glowing screens inside sealed rooms, models played out catastrophe in vivid detail. One showed Atlas fragmenting in high orbit, its debris raining down across continents like a shotgun blast from the sky. Another simulated a controlled descent, the object slowing unnaturally as though preparing for entry. That one silenced the room, an interstellar visitor choosing not to bypass Earth but to arrive. The scientists who helped build the models begged caution, insisting the inputs were speculative, the outcomes exaggerated. But the officials in attendance heard only the scale of the consequences. They saw maps of cities vanishing under shockwaves, oceans rising with tsunamis, skies choking with ash. They saw probabilities, however slim, written as numbers on reports stamped with urgency. Numbers had always carried power, and here they carried dread. Some simulations ventured further still. A defense contractor presented models not of impact, but of influence. Electromagnetic pulses, originating from Atlas, disrupting satellites, blinding communication networks, even crippling power grids. Though unproven, the idea wormed into the minds of strategists. What if Atlas was not a rock at all, but a machine? What if it had a purpose not of collision but of surveillance, or worse, control? Among the agencies, divisions deepened. Some argued for disclosure. The public had a right to know the risks, however uncertain. Others insisted that panic would only destabilize societies further. In one closed session, a general slammed his fist on the table, demanding preparations for impact contingencies. Across from him, a scientist pleaded, reminding the room that there was no evidence Atlas sought harm. The clash was not just of facts, but of philosophies. Was humanity safer in ignorance or in truth? The existence of the simulations themselves became a kind of ghost story among those with partial access. Analysts whispered of the doom runs, files that showed the end of cities, the collapse of networks, the unraveling of human order. Few had seen them, but all had heard of them. Their very secrecy gave them power, the way myths gain strength when denied but never disproven. Outside, the world remained unaware. Children pointed at Atlas's glow with wonder. Lovers named it a lucky star. Poets described it as a flame of hope. They did not know that in hidden rooms, its light was being fed into machines that projected ruin. The duality was unbearable. Beauty in the open sky, terror behind closed doors. In one late-night session, a young analyst stared at the glowing arcs of simulated destruction, her hands trembling above the keyboard. She wrote in her private log, "I think we are not simulating Atlas. We are simulating ourselves, our fear of what we cannot control. It shines above us, indifferent, while we burned shadows into our own minds. Yet the simulations continued, day after day, refining, sharpening, producing numbers that grew heavier with each iteration. And though none could say with certainty what Atlas truly was, one conclusion began to spread quietly, unspoken but deeply felt. If an interstellar object could move as though guided, then humanity's place in the cosmos was no longer passive. It was precarious. The simulations of doom were not predictions. They were mirrors, reflecting humanity's terror at the thought that the sky itself might one day choose to look back. The astronomer's confession. For months, the world had been fed fragments, data stripped of context, images filtered through secrecy, whispers buried beneath denials. But it was not the agencies, nor the governments, who broke the silence first. It was a single astronomer, weary of silence, worn down by the weight of what he had seen. His confession did not come in a press release or a formal publication, but in a series of voice recordings leaked late at night to a small group of colleagues. Within days, those recordings escaped their intended circle, spreading across digital networks like wildfire. The astronomer was not a man prone to dramatics. His career was marked by careful work. His reputation for precision and modesty earned over decades of observing skies from mountaintop observatories. That was what made his confession so powerful. His voice, normally calm, now trembled with exhaustion as he described the nights he had spent watching Atlas. He spoke not as a scientist defending a theory, but as a human being recounting an encounter he could no longer deny. "I have logged every flare, every deviation," he said in the first recording. "I have compared them against every model we possess. None of them hold. None. I am forced to say this, though it shames me to admit it. Atlas does not behave like an inert body. It behaves like something aware of being observed." He recounted details never shared publicly. On more than one occasion, his observatory's instruments had registered brightness changes within minutes of calibration shifts, too quick, too precise to be explained by natural timing. He described how, during one session, as his team aligned multiple instruments toward Atlas, the object flared with such intensity that their sensors were momentarily blinded. It was as if his voice cracked, as if it were answering. In later recordings, he grew more candid, describing personal logs he had kept outside official channels. "I wrote down the things I could not place into reports," he admitted. "Notes of unease, patterns that suggested response. Dreams I began to have after long nights of watching, dreams of a light that pulsed like a heartbeat, watching me as I watched it." His confession carried not only data but emotion. He described the loneliness of knowing something extraordinary and being forbidden to speak it. He spoke of colleagues silenced by fear of losing their positions, of phone calls that ended abruptly when questions pressed too close to the truth. His voice, ragged, bore the weight of betrayal not by Atlas, but by the very institutions meant to protect knowledge. What shook listeners most was not his analysis, but his conclusion. "I cannot tell you what Atlas is," he said, "but I can tell you what it is not. It is not a comet, it is not a rock, it is not chance, it is performing, and we are its audience, and I no longer know whether we are meant to applaud or to fear." The recordings spread quickly, dissected by skeptics and believers alike. Some dismissed them as the ramblings of a man broken by sleepless nights and professional isolation. Others insisted he had finally voiced what many had long suspected but dared not say aloud. Within days, transcripts appeared in newspapers. Talk shows debated whether he was a whistleblower or a fantasist. But for those who had seen the raw data themselves, his words cut deep. Inside observatories, some felt a sense of grim relief. One scientist confessed privately, "He said what we all feel, but cannot admit. He has taken the weight from us and placed it on himself." Others grew angry, fearing that his confession would undermine credibility, that the fragile line between science and speculation would crumble under ridicule. But no one could erase the recordings now. They were part of the record, and the world had heard them. The astronomer himself vanished from public life soon after. Some claimed he had been silenced by agencies, others that he had retreated into self-imposed exile. His colleagues received no further word, only the echo of his voice carried across the networks. Weary, haunted, yet unflinching. His confession became both a rallying cry and a warning, quoted in articles, repeated in documentaries, etched into the growing mythology of Atlas. It marked a turning point. Until then, the story of Atlas had been a war of data and denials, of leaks and rebuttals. But with the astronomer's confession, the narrative became personal, human. No longer was it about faceless agencies or anonymous reports. It was about one man who looked at the sky, saw something he could not explain, and chose to speak the truth of his fear. And in that truth, whispered into microphones in the stillness of night, he gave voice to a question humanity had carried silently for months. Was Atlas merely passing through, or was it here for us? The public awakens. The astronomer's confession, carried in crackling audio across forums and news sites, acted like a spark in a parched forest. For months, the story of Atlas had belonged to specialists, officials, and those willing to chase faint signals through encrypted channels. Now, suddenly, it belonged to everyone. His words, raw, trembling, painfully human, broke through the fog of denials and silence. People who had never cared for telescopes or light curves now looked upward at the faint star that should not have been there, asking themselves what it meant. In cities around the world, conversations shifted. Cafes buzzed with arguments over whether Atlas was a comet or a craft. On buses, strangers leaned across aisles to point out the faint glow in the night sky. Talk shows ran heated debates between scientists defending caution and commentators insisting humanity had already been contacted. Even in homes where the subject was never spoken aloud, the presence of that light overhead carried an unspoken weight. It was as though the sky itself had become aware of the millions of eyes turned toward it. The media, which had until then treated Atlas as a minor science story, pivoted sharply. Headlines shouted phrases like, "The visitor in the sky," "An astronomer breaks silence on mysterious object." Some outlets stoked fear, emphasizing the worst-case scenarios whispered in leaked reports. Others leaned into wonder, framing Atlas as the greatest discovery in human history. Documentaries appeared almost overnight, weaving the astronomer's words with archival myths of sky wanderers. Streaming platforms, ever quick to seize opportunity, announced series dramatizing humanity's first contact. Not clone. Governments scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Officials held press conferences, their voices strained with carefully rehearsed reassurances. "There is no evidence Atlas poses a threat," they repeated, again and again. But their words were drowned beneath the chorus of voices now rising from below. For every denial, there was a video of Atlas flaring brighter than the stars around it, a reminder that something extraordinary was unfolding above. Grassroots movements erupted. In Europe, stargazing vigils gathered thousands in open fields, people lying on blankets, watching the sky in silence as if awaiting revelation. In Asia, temples filled with worshippers who lit lanterns in honor of the heavenly guest. In Africa, poets and musicians began weaving Atlas into their art, calling it a mirror of humanity's longing. And online, countless groups formed, some dedicated to decoding the disputed signal, others to preparing for what they believed was inevitable contact. But with awakening came division. For every gathering of hopefuls, there were pockets of fear. Religious leaders in some countries declared Atlas a harbinger of judgment. Preppers began stockpiling supplies, convinced the simulations of doom would prove prophetic. Rumors of panic buying surfaced in cities where whispers of impact spread unchecked. The same light that inspired wonder in some hearts planted dread in others. Inside observatories, the atmosphere grew tense. Scientists who had long pleaded for caution found themselves thrust into the spotlight, forced to answer questions they had no answers for. They stood before microphones, insisting that more data was needed, that nothing was certain, yet their hesitations only fed the sense that something was being hidden. A few, emboldened by the astronomer's confession, spoke more openly, admitting that Atlas's behavior was highly unusual and not fully understood. Those words, though measured, were seized upon as confirmation by a public hungry for truth. The awakening spread even to the youngest. Children drew pictures of glowing comets with eyes, teachers fielded endless questions about life beyond Earth, and playground conversations filled with speculation about whether Atlas was a ship or a star. A generation was quietly being marked, its imagination shaped by the presence of a light that refused to be ordinary. In the midst of it all, Atlas itself remained unchanged, aloof, brilliant, indifferent to the chaos it sowed. Night after night it flared with impossible brightness, as though reminding Earth that the story was not finished. The more humanity stared upward, the more it felt as though the object stared back. The public awakening was not a single moment but a tide, unstoppable and vast. Governments could not contain it, scientists could not quiet it, skeptics could not smother it. Atlas had transcended data and entered the realm of myth, living simultaneously as science, omen, beacon, and mystery. It had become not just an object in the sky, but a presence in the human mind. And as the tide of awareness rose, so too did anticipation. People began to ask not whether Atlas was natural or artificial, but what it might do next. For once awakened, humanity could no longer look away. When brightness turns violent, the first surge came without warning, a sudden blaze across the heavens that startled even those who had grown accustomed to Atlas's unpredictable flares. For weeks, the object had pulsed with impossible light. But this was different, this was violent. Instruments registered the change not as a gradual increase but as an explosion, a spike so sharp it overwhelmed sensors and scorched data channels. Amateur astronomers who had been photographing Atlas that night found their images washed in white, their cameras blinded. To the naked eye, it was no longer a faint glow, it was a wound torn into the sky. Across continents, people noticed. In rural towns and crowded cities alike, eyes turned upward as the heavens lit with a brilliance that seemed almost unnatural. Some gasped in awe, others trembled in fear. Power grids flickered in certain regions, their operators later blaming geomagnetic interference, though the timing aligned too neatly with the flare. For a brief moment, Atlas rivaled the brightest stars, a furious beacon commanding the attention of an entire planet. And then, just as suddenly, the light dimmed, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than the blaze itself. Observatories scrambled to interpret what had happened. Data streams poured in, ultraviolet spikes, bursts of radiation, signatures unlike any seen in natural cometary behavior. One astrophysicist, pale and exhausted, muttered into a recorder, "This is not sublimation, this is discharge. Something has released energy." But what mechanism could a fragment of rock possess to unleash such fury? None of the models fit. None could even begin to hold the shape of what was unfolding. Governments convened emergency sessions. Military satellites had registered not just light but structured emissions, patterns of energy that looked, disturbingly, like pulses. Analysts debated whether it was a weapon test, a communication burst, or something else entirely. The forbidden report was quietly reopened, its redacted pages re-examined with new urgency. Words like offensive capability appeared in briefings, whispered behind closed doors. If Atlas could release energy deliberately, what else might it be capable of? The public, already awakened by the astronomer's confession, now faced something undeniable. Videos circulated of the sky flaring brighter than Venus, of entire crowds gasping as though witnessing a revelation. Hashtags trended worldwide, some proclaiming Atlas, a herald of hope, others crying doom. Churches filled overnight, and in some places, panic spread. Markets emptied, schools closed, communities whispered of the end. The light had crossed a threshold, no longer mysterious, but frightening in its intensity. Among scientists, the mood was fractured. Some clung desperately to natural explanations. Perhaps Atlas had fractured, releasing reflective debris. Others admitted the data betrayed such comfort. One confided anonymously, "It's not breaking apart, it's choosing when to burn." The idea that the object might choose, that it might act, was unthinkable, yet the evidence pressed against denial like a relentless tide. As days passed, the surges continued. Not every night, not in predictable intervals, but enough to erode certainty. Sometimes the brightness doubled, other times it quintupled, always accompanied by bursts of radiation that rattled instruments. Astronomers who once spoke with clinical precision now wrote in journals with tones closer to prayer. One recorded, "Each flare feels like anger. If light can rage, this is what rage looks like." And through it all, humanity watched. Children who once drew Atlas as a star now painted it as a burning eye. Poets abandoned metaphors of guidance and instead spoke of judgment. The object had shifted in perception. No longer a guest, no longer even a performer. It had become something closer to a predator, its brilliance a display of power rather than beauty. In the background, the disputed signal flared again, louder than before, as if synchronized with the bursts of light. Radio telescopes trembled under its insistence, recording sequences of pulses that looked less and less like random noise. Analysts worked feverishly, dividing into camps, those convinced it was language, those certain it was calculation, those who whispered it was warning, yet none could prove what it meant. When brightness turns violent, awe turns to dread. Atlas had crossed that line, and humanity felt it deep in its bones. The sky, once a place of distant comfort, now carried a presence that could not be ignored. And in the stillness after each flare, as the object dimmed and the stars reclaimed their quiet glow, a deeper fear grew. If these bursts were only a display, what would happen when Atlas chose to act in earnest? The forgotten story of others. As Atlas burned brighter and its violent flares unsettled humanity, the world's attention turned not only forward to its trajectory, but backward into the deep well of memory. Across cultures, stories long buried under dust and dismissal began to resurface, pulled into the light by those desperate to make sense of the present. The question whispered, through late-night conversations, through old libraries, through corners of the internet humming with feverish energy. Had we seen them before? Anthropologists and folklorists began combing through archives with new eyes. What had once been dismissed as myth or metaphor now seemed to carry uncanny parallels. Ancient Sumerian texts described chariots of fire that blazed across the sky, not with tails like comets, but with sudden bursts of light, erratic and deliberate. In Egyptian hieroglyphs, priests had carved depictions of sky boats, descending in beams, their arrival linked to upheaval and renewal. Scholars had long interpreted these as symbols, stories born of human imagination. But now, with Atlas blazing unnaturally, those carvings felt less like invention and more like memory. In Mesoamerica, myths spoke of the others from the stars, beings who came not as gods but as observers, marked by the appearance of a wandering fire that beat like a heart. The Mayans described ceremonies of appeasement when the fire appeared, offering gifts not to gods, but to watchers. It was a detail once overlooked, but now, when aligned with Atlas's pulsating brightness, it struck like revelation. Were these myths describing the same phenomenon, thousands of years before telescopes? In Europe, medieval manuscripts told of a blazing visitor that came before great pestilence. One monk wrote of an orb in the sky that flashed as though speaking. His abbot forbade him to write further, declaring the vision demonic. The monk's words survived only in marginal notes, overlooked until the present, when scholars pieced them together with trembling hands. The description of flashing rhythmic light matched eerily with the disputed signals Atlas now emitted. Indigenous traditions, too, held stories that resonated with uncanny precision. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia spoke of the Wandjina, sky beings who came with lights that pulsed in the heavens, shaping the land and teaching survival. The Hopi in North America told of Kachinas, star spirits whose visits were marked by sudden brilliance in the night sky. These were not stories of comets, they were stories of watchers, of others whose appearances were always temporary, always leaving behind silence and unanswered questions. As these fragments surfaced, historians began to notice a theme that chilled them. The others were never permanent. They came, they shone, they disrupted, and then they left. Always transient, always elusive, always just beyond comprehension. And humanity, across cultures, had always responded with awe and fear, offering worship, writing myths, building monuments to anchor the memory of the sky's intrusion. The phrase "forgotten story of the others" began circulating online, popularized by writers and speakers who wove together myth, history, and Atlas's present performance. Documentaries replayed ancient legends alongside modern telescope footage, blurring the line between archaeology and prophecy. Some called Atlas the return of the others, a continuation of a dialogue humanity had never fully understood. Others warned that the stories carried a darker note, that the others always came before upheaval, that their visits were less blessing than omen. Inside agencies, the myths were not dismissed. Analysts compiled thick dossiers of cultural accounts, cross-referencing descriptions of unnatural brightness and pulsing signals. To intelligence officers, myth was not superstition but pattern recognition. If humanity had indeed encountered such phenomena before, then those accounts, however wrapped in legend, might contain warnings relevant now. It was whispered that some officials took these stories more seriously than the science, as though fearing that the ancients had left behind knowledge more accurate than modern instruments. And yet, the most haunting detail of all was silence. The others in the old stories never stayed. They came, they burned bright, they terrified, and they departed. Humanity was left each time with memory but no answers, myth but no dialogue. It was as if the sky had always been the stage for a performance too grand for the audience to understand, a performance Atlas was now reprising. In a late-night interview, an aging folklorist put it simply, "The stories never end with understanding. They end with absence. The others arrive, and then they vanish. We are left only with shadows. If Atlas is theirs, then we are only the latest to watch the play." The forgotten story of the others had been remembered. And with its remembering came a chilling awareness. Atlas might not be the first, nor would it be the last. It was simply the latest visitation in a long cycle of encounters humanity was never allowed to keep. Edge of revelation. By now, Atlas was no longer just a distant wanderer in the night. It had become a presence, an uninvited guest whose every flare unsettled the earth below. Governments whispered behind locked doors, scientists scribbled in journals they dared not publish, and ordinary people lay awake at night, staring at a sky that seemed to breathe. Humanity stood at the edge of something vast and unknown, and everyone felt it in their bones. The revelation was close. The signals, once disputed, had grown louder. Radio telescopes around the globe confirmed the bursts, no longer faint anomalies but deliberate, repeating structures. The patterns refused randomness, dancing just beyond comprehension, as if inviting but never yielding meaning. Analysts argued late into the night, was it code, mathematics, music? Some insisted it was a greeting, others a warning. No consensus came, only the heavy awareness that the universe was no longer silent. At the same time, Atlas's trajectory defied predictions once more. The silent acceleration that had haunted astronomers now revealed itself with bolder confidence. Instead of continuing on a clean interstellar path, the object's course bent ever so slightly toward Earth. Not enough to guarantee approach, but enough to erode the fragile comfort of probability. Models diverged wildly, some projecting a near miss, others whispering of a rendezvous. Every simulation was a mirror of dread, yet none could be proven wrong. The world divided into camps. Some embraced Atlas as a herald, a long-awaited messenger proving humanity was not alone. Vigils turned into celebrations, people gathering under the stars with candles, singing to the silent visitor. Others recoiled in fear, treating each flare as an omen of calamity, stockpiling supplies and retreating into bunkers. And in between, the majority waited caught between awe and terror, between hope and despair. The object in the sky had become a mirror of human longing and human fear, reflecting both with equal brilliance. Inside agencies, the mood was frantic. Satellites tasked with high-resolution imaging returned results that only deepened the mystery. Outlines too geometric for ice, reflections too sharp for dust. The forbidden report's speculation that Atlas might be a platform no longer seemed absurd. Officials debated disclosure again, their voices raised and strained. One side argued that hiding the truth would only breed chaos. The other insisted that revealing it could shatter the fragile order of societies already fraying. The debate never resolved. Each meeting ended in stalemate, while Atlas continued to burn brighter, indifferent to human indecision. For scientists closest to the data, the edge of revelation felt like a precipice. Some dreamed of discovery that would rewrite the story of existence, proof that intelligence had flourished beyond Earth. Others dreaded what revelation might mean, that humanity was not being invited into the cosmos, but surveyed, perhaps judged. One astronomer wrote privately, "We are standing in a doorway, but we cannot see if it opens to wonder or to fire." The public sphere grew louder with each flare. Rumors spread of governments preparing for contact, of secret transmissions beamed toward Atlas, of shadowy agencies intercepting replies. Most of these claims were unverifiable, yet they carried power because they fed into the growing sense that something monumental was unfolding just beyond reach. Humanity no longer asked whether Atlas was natural. That question had been buried beneath data, confession, and myth. Now the only question was, what happens when it arrives? In small towns and great cities alike, people gathered at night, necks craned, staring at the luminous wound in the sky. Some prayed, some cursed, some simply watched in silence, unable to look away. For the first time in history, the entire planet seemed united in attention, not by war, not by disaster, but by a single light that should not exist. And then came the moment that tipped everything further. Atlas flared again, brighter than ever before, so fierce it outshone Jupiter. Instruments registered a simultaneous surge in the disputed signal, louder, sharper, structured as though shaped deliberately. For a heartbeat, humanity's machines and eyes alike were blinded. When the flare dimmed, leaving shadows across screens and retinas, one truth hung in the air, undeniable. Atlas had chosen to announce itself. No one knew what would follow. No one could say if it was greeting or judgment, miracle or menace. But everyone understood one thing. The age of speculation was ending. Humanity stood at the edge of revelation, and once the veil was lifted, there would be no turning back. The silence before truth. The night after the flare, the world held its breath. Atlas, which for months had pulsed with defiance, now shone with an unsettling steadiness. No sudden bursts, no violent surges, only a calm, unwavering glow, as if the object itself had exhaled after its display. It was this quiet that unnerved humanity most, for silence after revelation is not comfort, it is expectation. Around the globe, radio telescopes remained trained on its position, straining for more of the disputed signals. Yet the frequencies fell mute. The regular pulses that had teased of language or code vanished, leaving only the hiss of the cosmos. Analysts replayed recordings, checked equipment, recalibrated, but the sky offered no reply. Atlas had gone quiet, as if satisfied that its message had been delivered, and was now waiting for humanity's response. In the streets, in homes, in the highest halls of power, the mood mirrored that silence. For once, the endless noise of daily life seemed diminished. People still debated, argued, hoped, and feared, but beneath all of it was the same awareness. Something monumental had been set in motion, and now the world waited. The debates about whether Atlas was natural or artificial faded into irrelevance. That question had been eclipsed by a larger one: why it had chosen to burn so brightly, and what it meant by its sudden silence. Governments, too, found themselves paralyzed. Contingency plans lay drafted, simulations of doom still ran in cold rooms, but no one knew which to act upon. Should they prepare for impact, for contact, for nothing at all? Intelligence agencies that had once fought to keep information secret now found themselves with no more knowledge than the public, staring at the same still light in the sky, just as blind. Silence had become the great equalizer. In villages, farmers paused in their fields to watch the glow. In sprawling cities, people leaned from balconies, craning necks skyward. In deserts, mountains, and coastlines, humanity gathered under one canopy of stars, united by waiting. For the first time in memory, the divisions of nation and creed seemed to dissolve, replaced by a single, shared suspense. The earth itself felt smaller beneath the gaze of something vast. For scientists, the silence was both mercy and torment. No new data, no new flares, no fresh anomalies, only the steady light, unyielding and perfect. Some begged for activity, for anything to break the stalemate. Others whispered in relief, grateful for the pause, afraid of what further revelation might bring. One astronomer, exhausted after weeks of vigilance, wrote in his journal, "We stand before a curtain. Atlas has drawn it halfway open. Now it waits to see if we dare to pull it the rest of the way." Stories of the others resurfaced once more, their endings echoing with cruel familiarity. They too had arrived, flared, unsettled, and then vanished into silence. Were those absences purposeful? Was humanity doomed to watch, to fear, to remember, and then to be abandoned again? Or was the silence itself part of the dialogue, a demand for us to answer rather than to ask? The waiting grew heavier with each passing night. Weeks of flares had conditioned humanity to expect spectacle. The sudden quiet felt like a withheld breath, as if the sky itself were listening. People began to speak of it not as an object, but as a presence, a watcher that had revealed just enough to unsettle, then withdrawn to measure the response. And still, Atlas burned, 20 times brighter than reason, steady and unblinking. No tail of ice, no plume of dust, only light, sharp and deliberate, hanging in the heavens like a question too vast for words. At last, the astronomer who had once confessed his fears gave one final statement, smuggled into the public sphere through a letter. His words, simple yet searing, captured what millions felt but could not articulate. Perhaps Atlas has already spoken. The brightness was the message, the silence, the question. We must decide what we will answer. The silence before truth stretched across the planet, binding billions in its grip. Some prayed, some despaired, some hoped, but none could escape the sense that something immense hovered just beyond comprehension. Whether Atlas would pass on like the visitors of old or descend into history with revelation was no longer humanity's choice. The sky had spoken, and now it waited. The silence before truth was here. And in that silence, Earth understood that everything had already changed.